If you drafted Josh Jacobs last year, the odds of you winning your fantasy championship went up exponentially. And the same can be said for guys like Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, and Miles Sanders as well. But what do these running backs all have in common, and can we use that to help identify this year's Josh Jacobs? That's what I aim to do in this video. I'm going to identify what those running backs all had in common and how we can use it to find this year's potential Josh Jacobs. Plus, I'm going to give you the pros and cons for some running backs who could be that guy this year. And finally, of course, I'm going to give you my absolute rock solid, maybe, pick for who could be this year's Josh Jacobs. Hey, before we get into that, go down below, drop a comment, let me know a running back that you think could be this year's Josh Jacobs. All right, let's start with what those running backs all had in common. First, you'll notice they were all drafted as running back threes, meaning they were drafted between running back 25 and 36. Second, they were fairly young, ages 24 or 25. Thirdly, they did not have a lot of wear and tear on them. In fact, only Miles Sanders and Josh Jacobs had over 500 touches, and only Josh Jacobs had over 800 career touches going into last year, and none of them had over 1,000 career touches. Finally, these were all guys with NFL experience who were proven to be good, productive running backs at some level. We didn't see any inexperienced rookie running backs, and I just don't think that's going to be the case this year either. So now that we have a baseline of what we should be looking for, who are the running backs that potentially fit these benchmarks? Well, let's of course start with the running backs being drafted as running back threes this year. We've got Isaiah Pacheco, Rachaad White, David Montgomery, James Conner, Javonte Williams, James Cook, Alvin Kamara, Zach Charbonnet, AJ Dillon, Samaje Perine, Brian Robinson, and Antonio Gibson. Now this is a fairly long list. This is 12 running backs. I'm obviously not going to break down the pros and cons of all 12 of these running backs, so let's see if we can narrow this list down even more. When we talked about the guys who did it last year, we mentioned these are younger guys who don't have a lot of touches, so let's take a look. We've got to eliminate David Montgomery. He's 26 years old, has over 1,000 touches. I do like David Montgomery this year, but he's probably not going to be this year's Josh Jacobs. Same with James Conner. He's 28 years old, has over 1,100 touches, and while I think he'll be a solid RB2 and is a good value where he's being drafted, again, probably not this year's Josh Jacobs. Alvin Kamara, 28, over 1,500 touches, total dust. Get this guy out of here for sure. And then Samaje Perine is interesting, only has 500 touches, but he is 28 years old, so we're going to have to scratch him off the list. All right, so that certainly helps. We're down to 8 guys now, but let's see if we can narrow it down even a little bit more. I'm going to cross off Javonte Williams. I know he's young. I know he doesn't have a lot of touches, but he's coming off a major knee injury. It's hard to see him finishing as a top 10 or especially a top 5 running back. Don't think we see a healthy Javonte Williams till at least the very end of the season, if at all this year. And I'm also going to have to knock off Zach Charbonnet. Again, talked about it. Needs some experience here. Some guys with some NFL experience. He's a rookie. He's behind Kenneth Walker. Very unlikely he's going to be the guy this year. All right, so now we have a list that is much more manageable, just 6 guys. Let's take a look at the pros and cons of each one of these guys, and then as promised, I will give you my pick. Starting with Isaiah Pacheco. What are the pros? Well, he's in one of the best offenses in the NFL, a fantasy-friendly offense. Also, he looked good in his limited work last season, so we know he has the potential. What are the cons? Well, even though this is a great offense, it relies mostly on the passing game and doesn't really feature the running game. Also, Pacheco, a guy who's not going to be heavily involved in the passing game, that could limit his potential upside. Rachaad White, the pros, we know he's an elite pass catcher, has elite pass catching potential, even splitting with Leonard Fournette last year, had 50 catches. Also, very little competition for touches here. Who's behind him? Keyshawn Vaughn, undrafted Sean Tucker. He should be locked into a workhorse role. What are the cons? Well, this offense could be one of, if not the worst offense in the entire NFL this year, which could limit his touchdown upside. Plus, he just wasn't very good as a rookie. There's no way around it. He just wasn't very good. Now, entering year 2, he could get better, but that is definitely something that could be worrisome. Next up, James Cook, the pros. Again, he's in another elite offense like Isaiah Pacheco. The Bills, one of the best offenses in real life and for fantasy. Also, he's a very good pass catcher and a very efficient runner. This isn't a guy who's going to need 300, 350 touches. He's a guy, you get him in space, he can make things happen. What are the cons? Well, kind of like the Chiefs, this offense also relies heavily on the passing game and doesn't really feature the running back position. Also, he's likely never going to be a guy that's going to get a ton of touches. He's only 199 pounds. He's behind Damian Harris. He'll never be a workhorse running back. Now, A.J. Dillon is an interesting one because we know his pros are he's got workhorse potential. If something ever happened to Aaron Jones, this guy would be an every down back. He also has massive touchdown upside because this is a guy that's going to get used heavily around the goal line. Well, what are the cons? Well, I just talked about one of them. He's splitting with Aaron Jones, who, even though he's getting up there in age, was still highly efficient last year and will have a role. Also, he's never going to be heavily used as a pass catcher. He did get a little more involved last year, but even if Aaron Jones were to get hurt, this isn't a guy who's going to catch 50, 60 plus passes. Then we finish with a couple of Commanders running backs. Let's start with Brian Robinson. The pros are he's probably going to get a lot of carries. We saw it last year. He was getting a ton of carries in this offense. Also, you got to think he'll be more efficient now that he's fully recovered from being shot in the leg. What are the cons? Well, I talked about the offense with Rachaad White. This offense also might be one of the worst. We don't know how Sam Howell is going to be. We don't know how this offense is going to be this year, so some question marks there. Also, a guy who's never going to be heavily used as a pass catcher, which again, could limit his ceiling. And then finally, the other Commanders running back, Antonio Gibson. The pros here, we know this guy has the ability to catch a ton of passes. He should be the pass catching back. Had over 40 catches each of the last 2 years, and that was with J.D. McKissic on the roster. Also, he's shown the ability to be a workhorse in the past. He's got the size. He's done it before. So what are the cons? Well, I just talked about it with Brian Robinson. This offense could be one of the worst. A lot of uncertainty here with this offense. Also, he's stuck behind Brian Robinson, which will limit the amount of touches he can get in this offense going forward. All right, now that we've broken down the pros and cons of each of our candidates, it's time for me to give you my pick. But first, I got to remind you, flockfantasy.com/endgame is where you need to be this fantasy football season. Not only are you going to get access to our rankings, bonus articles, bonus videos, bonus live streams in the season, plus our draft guides, you're also going to have a chance to play fantasy football with and against us and win cash prizes. We're going to do dynasty leagues. We're going to do redraft leagues. So if you're looking for more leagues and you want to play against myself and Pierre and potentially win $100, $50, plus get a free endgame shirt, check it out. flockfantasy.com/endgame. 30% off if you subscribe now. All right, now the moment you've been waiting for. I promised it. I'm going to pick the player I think will be this year's Josh Jacobs. And I need to start and say, I don't feel great about any of these guys potentially being this year's Josh Jacobs. But again, nobody thought last year's Josh Jacobs would be last year's Josh Jacobs, so you never know. I will say, first of all, runner-up is going to be Antonio Gibson. Love Antonio Gibson this year. Love his value. Love his pass catching. But he's not going to be Josh Jacobs without a Brian Robinson injury, and that injury is going to have to happen in training camp. But I do think he could be this year's Ramondre Stevenson. But the guy I'm picking to be this year's Josh Jacobs at this moment is Rachaad White. He's the only guy out of this list that you can feel great is locked into a workhorse role, will also catch a ton of passes. He should get a ton of touches in this offense. Maybe the touchdowns won't be there, but if they are, Rachaad White could absolutely smash in fantasy football this year and help many, many teams to fantasy championships. So that's my pick for Josh Jacobs. If you haven't yet, go down below, comment who's your pick to be this year's Josh Jacobs. And when you're done with that, check out this video right here where we talk about some league winners you should be drafting this year.